Great. Thank you, Larry, and appreciate this chance to spend an hour or so with you. I try to do this for this course, given I was one of the co-authors with Irs of this program management course, and certainly in this kind of hour, the first thing I'd like to say is let's make it interactive. This is about helping you and for me to be able to relate some of my real life experiences as a program manager in the past and as one that has reviewed many programs in the past. And so, but I also want to make it valuable to you. So if you have questions, you have comments, you want to get into a bit of a dialogue, I think it makes it a richer presentation. And so don't hesitate to use the chat or chime in and ask me questions. Larry had introduced me already, so I don't have to go necessarily through my background, but I like doing this because I think, and I've gotten some very good feedback from attendees in the past when I have. So hopefully it will go well in that same regard. So let me maybe just a little bit more background about myself. I've spent 30 years or so in IT, and a good part of it being on projects and then on programs and then ultimately running both projects and programs. And so I've got a lot of real world experience, as I said, and some of it's been failure and some of it's been success, and we'll talk about some examples of both and what I've learned from both and how that's been integrated into this course. And throughout this hour, I'll refer to a few of the slides, a few that you've seen already, because as I understand it from Larry, you've gotten through chapter 5, all the way through chapter 5, and a couple slides that you will see. So maybe I'll introduce some topics to you as I talk that you haven't covered yet in the course, but hopefully that when Larry goes through it, it will be then good reinforcement of what I've said. So I spent about 20 years in the private sector, and first part of my career after getting degrees in engineering, and then I ended up going into government. But before I went into government, I actually did a lot, as I said, project and program work, including large engagements for the likes of Bell South in the telecommunications industry, and for a number of financial services firms, including CSFB, Goldman Sachs, and Merrill Lynch. So got some really good, I would say, large project management experience, both in the government as well as in the private sector. And I was asked to come into the IRS, into our Internal Revenue Service. And if any of you are not U.S. citizens or don't live in the U.S., IRS is the organization in the federal government of the U.S. that does our tax collections. And so I was actually knew some folks, including the former commissioner of the IRS at the time. And so I was asked to come in to interview and ended up was being offered a job to become the program manager of what was then called the Business Systems Modernization Program in the IRS. And this is back in the 2004 timeframe. So BSM for short, Business Systems Modernization. And at the time, it was touted as one of the, if not the most, one of the world's most complex modernization programs ever undertaken for IT. $5 billion program to be run over about 10 years. And I did not come in at the start. The program was instituted around the year 2000, and I was coming in year 3, year 4 kind of time frame, and frankly, the program was in trouble. And this was on top of the fact that this isn't the first time the IRS had tried to do some real modernization. If you go back, they had tried to modernize some back in the early 90s, well actually late 80s and then early 90s twice before, and had really failed. And had spent hundreds of millions of dollars and had gotten little for it. And so this was really the third major time at this. And why did they have to modernize? Well, they had run into a situation where they had built many, many legacy systems. And in fact, if you go way back in the 1960s, they were actually one of the world's leaders in using software to help automate tax processing or any kind of processing. Their first programs that they built were actually built in assembler language, which is kind of a very, very base language that you would run on computers, all running on mainframe technology. And so they were a world leader at one point. But the problem was is they kept building system upon system upon system over time and not modernizing some of these systems that they had originally built. And so these efforts were really to try to, if you will, create new modern systems to be able to serve our tax administration system. And so I was asked, and it's funny, it's one of these personal things where I was asked to come in and given an offer to run this business systems modernization program. I had no intention of going into government. It was not in my plan at all. But it's one of those things, those life things where you kind of go, wow, I mean, someone's just asked me to take over certainly one of the most complex IT undertakings for modernization that's ever existed. And you kind of go, how do you say no to that if you feel like you could be successful? With my background and what I had done, it seemed like, not that it wasn't intimidating, it certainly was to step into the role, but it seemed like I could really bring something to the game. And so I did decide to step into the role and really, we'll talk about some of my experiences as I went forward. But I want to start you off with something that kind of helps put this course in context and why I think program management is so important, okay? And that's this whole notion, and you guys covered this already, this whole notion of tying true corporate, or in the case of IRS, true mission strategy with actual execution. And if you really look at it, and you can use all the new fancy terms you want and talk about agile and talk about all this, but when it comes right down to it, if you're trying to drive major change in an organization of any scale, and I don't mean you have to be, scale like an IRS with 100,000 employees, but even small or particularly mid-sized firms and above, if you don't do program management well together with project management, you will not make much progress. And I always say this, it's a lot easier to do strategy than it is to execute well. And what, to me, good program management is about executing well. But you got to know what you're trying to execute to and for. And so I love this chart that we were able to pull together in the course, and you should have seen this back in chapter 2, where it really ties together, I think, pretty succinctly, this notion of doing good strategic planning at the top there, but how that interrelates with what you really need to do from an enterprise architecture perspective, from a portfolio management perspective, that ultimately drives down to the setting up of programs and the setting up projects under programs. And I recognize that in many organizations, this could be simplified a bit. We don't dive too much into this course into portfolio management, but it is another discipline that's very, very important. And I'll give you an example of that in the IRS here in a little bit. But the point being is that this needs to work together as an integrated whole, if you will, to know that when you're the program manager, if you're in that program management box, that you truly are understanding what it is you're trying to achieve, okay? And I believe you covered already benefits and that chapter. And the idea of understanding what the benefits of the program are and keeping your mind as a program manager focused on assuring you're driving towards those benefits. And how do you have a crisp understanding of what those benefits really should be? By having, if you will, this holistic view. And if you don't have any of these pieces, doesn't mean you can't run a program, doesn't mean you can't run a program successfully, but it's harder because essentially you've got weakness elsewhere. Maybe it's weakness in your enterprise architecture, maybe it's weakness in portfolio management. Hopefully it's not weakness in strategic planning, because if you're not doing any strategic planning, you really don't know where you're going as an organization. But it's always say this, nobody's ever got it perfection. And a big part of program management is to understand where you do have weaknesses and work hard to shore them up. But the notion of us having a good enterprise architecture together with portfolios, if you need them, in order to simplify the view of the organization, I think is profound. And what do I mean by this? And by the way, I'm talking away. I can't see you guys. So please, if you have questions or the like, don't hesitate to jump in and ask me questions, get clarification and the like. But I want to make this real, and hopefully Larry at least walked you through this quickly. This is a real life example that we did in the IRS. One of the projects under the program I ran was the Modernized e-file program. I'm going to come back to this program and talk about how we actually delivered this. But this gives you a good example of the line of sight that you'd like to see from a high-level goal as part of the IRS strategy. So the goal was to deliver high-quality and timely service to reduce taxpayer burden and encourage voluntary compliance. And the objective under that goal, one of them was to reduce taxpayer burden, increase return accuracy at filing through timely and efficient tax administration processing. And that was really what was the driver to build what we call the modernized e-file platform. When I arrived, there was an old platform that only handled the individual tax reforms, the 1040s, and it was antiquated, and we were worried that it couldn't really scale to handle other return types. So the Modernized e-file project was all about building a platform that could handle all of the return types that were filed with the IRS. And interestingly, we started out with probably the hardest one. We actually started out with the 1120, which is the U.S. corporate return, which can be very, very, very complex. And I'll give you some examples later, but we started out with that return type, and in order to show that we could actually do this. And in fact, Modernized e-file became such a success that it has essentially fulfilled its, and it is running day in and day out, and has all of the form types of the IRS that you can file electronically, and including now the 1040, which was migrated to it, I think at least half a dozen years ago now. So it really was a major success, and one of the major successes that came out of the BSM program. But as you can see, we drove down that line of sight, working with the enterprise architects to actually come up with a very high-level set of program requirements here for Modernized e-file, starting with the implementation of e-filing of 1120 rather, and then mandating that e-filing for large corporations. And I'm going to come back to that story here a little bit later. But I just want to emphasize the importance of that line of sight from a goal all the way down to program requirements, and you looking at it from a benefits perspective. What is it, the value you're providing as a program back to the corporation, back to the government agency, back to whoever you're working for? And keeping that front of mind, because things change, right? And the way you can provide those benefits can change. And I always say that be careful, because in a multi-year program, it could very well likely be that you may need to change your strategy about providing the benefit within the program. Maybe a new technology comes along, a new SaaS-based application comes along that could leapfrog you and help the organization realize that benefit a lot sooner, or a lot easier, a lot less risk. Those are the things as a program manager that you should be looking at, okay? There are many different ways to success, and how you start and where you finish may end up being two different things. The important thing is keeping the eye on the ball, working closely with your stakeholders in order to do that. So I wanted to set that kind of context for a lot of the work we did on the front end. And some of this was in place. They had an enterprise architecture, but I worked very hard with the team and with the rest of the IRS to really mature, if you will, the way in which we looked at the whole strategy, enterprise architecture, portfolios, and I'm going to show portfolios later in IRS as well as I talk about stakeholder engagement and then down to actual program requirements. So there's no questions at this point. Okay. All right. So now let me back up and walk you back to when I stepped into the IRS. So I joined. I mean, I obviously did some homework before taking the job to run the BSM program, but I got in and like any good person should do, you listen a lot at first, ask a lot of questions. And so I want to bring up two things that I discovered right away and why they are so concerning, were so concerning to me regarding where the BSM program was, okay? So the first thing that I noted was the structure of the program was this. The IRS and kind of mandated by Congress, by the way, based on the way it was first came out to be structured, because they had such problems on the two previous attempts to modernize. So they hired what they called a prime contractor. They put out this large procurement, hired a prime contractor, and then the prime contractor was to really do the bulk of the program management and run these projects. And so that was kind of the model. So we had a relatively thin layer of management from the government side on top of the top of the prime contractor. So I get in there and I'm starting to review these projects and the overall program and not seeing what I like, and things are not going well, and the dynamics between the government and the contractor, the prime contractor, were starting to really frazzle. I mean, anytime you go in and you see a lot of, you will, pointing the finger at the or at each other, that's not a very good sign that we weren't working really as a team. One of the things that I'd go out and visit then the owners, the business owners that own these projects, and I got very, very negative feedback, okay, about the relationships and how all this was going. And I guess, and you guys haven't talked about stakeholder management in detail yet, but let me ask you guys, if any of you are willing to chime in or talk about this, what's the dynamic there, those of you that have worked in these kind of relationships where you've used contractors a lot, what could be problematic about the way that this was set up as a program? Anybody want to answer that question for me? Trying to get you guys engaged.
Probably the reporting structure. Not really having a clear visibility to how things are going.
Not clear visibility on how things were going. I think that's part of it. I would agree there were some visibility issues. Anybody else? Okay, well, at least they got a little engagement. We'll work on that. So one of the things that struck me, and I've seen this time and time again, is if you're an executive in an organization and you're asked to essentially work with a contractor in a different part of the organization, that dynamic many times does not work very well. Essentially, IRS executives on the business side wanted to face off with IRS executives on the technology side or on the programmatic side, and we just didn't have that structure set up to be able to easily do that. And so we had this kind of disconnect, and you're right, this idea of visibility and transparency and understanding what was going on, not enough of that, and trust was being diminished because of this dynamic. So first thing that I recognized, probably took me a few months to recognize, that one of the things that I really worked on then was I started to really change the role of the program office in the IRS and beefing that up and taking more and more responsibility for the program within the government and reducing the responsibility of the prime contractor. Eventually, the prime contractor was ending up getting about half the work they were before. That's just the nature of it. Their performance deserved that they had to be taking off some projects, their role reduced. But the more important thing was to get more capability into the program office on the IRS side to be able to actually oversight these programs or projects, as well as to deal with all the stakeholder community. And we'll come back to that. So that was one big thing that I walked into that I immediately knew was a big problem and had to go to work on. The other thing, which also goes to stakeholders, was I'd go visit those in the legacy systems world. So what they had done is they had set up this small, as I mentioned, this small program office, and all the modernization projects were in this program. But I would go visit everybody and go try to meet everybody, and I go to the legacy, I go meet someone on the legacy side, okay? They absolutely had nothing to do with modernization. They were not asked their opinion. They were not brought into the loop. And frankly, what did that mean? Anybody want to give me an answer to that? What was the dynamic there? Amy? Go ahead. Can't hear you. Can't hear you, Amy.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Hello?
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that.
Now I can.
I was going to say, I think you would probably, that would generate some, I would think, some degree of animosity or some tension between the legacy and then the modernization folks. You're losing the perspective that the legacy people have on like what's not working well and what needs to be addressed in modernization. And then I haven't been in that situation where I'm like on a developer team, but I'm, you know, as the user community sort of has like the long-term relationship with the legacy folks, and so they may not buy in to the modernization, thinking that the ones that they work with all the time aren't being included in the decision making.
Absolutely spot on. Great answer, and that's exactly what the dynamic was. And in fact, it was so bad that you literally had those in the legacy, they were scared. I mean, they were scared for their jobs. They had no incentive to help. In fact, they had every incentive not to help. And what was even worse was when I go to program reviews and the projects, there was no perspective coming from legacy. And so there was so much knowledge that was not being leveraged into these new projects. It was astounding to me, and a recipe for failure. Because one of the things, and I haven't really described this, but this is an incredibly complex environment we're working in the IRS. More than 350 custom-built systems that are, if you will, integrating with each other, okay, in various ways in order to run the tax processing system for the United States. And you can imagine the complexity that goes with that. And there's just so much knowledge of those in legacy that are running those systems and continually upgrading those legacy systems. To not leverage that into modernization made no sense to me. And in fact, I was like, there's no doubt that we're going to fail under this model. So one of the things that I also did was I worked hard. It took about a year, but about a year after I joined, working with the then CIO, we were able to reorganize ourselves. And what we did was we essentially put together and created a new application development organization that had both modernization and legacy in it. So for instance, in the submission processing area, which is one of the portfolios that we defined in the IRS, submission processing, everything from taking your returns in by paper, and of course taking them in electronically, and all the systems that support all of that. We put those together. So now those that were running the legacy e-file system, at least ostensibly, had responsibility for modernized e-file as well, or they were part of the same organization. Obviously, day one, that doesn't break down all the barriers, but the idea was that over time, to really to break down these barriers, and for those that are in legacy to see a path forward. Let's help us modernize so that you can be part of this as we move forward. You can learn the modernized technology, you can continue to have a job, and help us be successful in this, trying to really change that dynamic. So those were two big things that I did coming in order to try to mitigate major risks. The other really big thing that I had to do was in my touring of going around and getting to know everybody, I'd go in and I'd visit what we would call our stakeholders. And obviously stakeholders are a lot of internal stakeholders, like all the business units that are going to be benefiting from this new systems and the like, up to including the commissioner of the IRS, of course. But then there were, and in government, there's other outside stakeholders. So you had OMB who allocates budget, and you'd have GAO who does oversight. You have your own IG, your own Inspector General who does oversight. You'd have folks up on the Hill, Congress people, both senators and House representatives and their staff. And so I'd go around all of these folks and low level of trust. And you guys are going to be studying this very soon. This afternoon you'll jump into it, but stakeholder engagement and the proper stakeholder engagement is one of the key to running a good program. And this is where I think program management really starts to differ from project management. A lot of times project management, you do have stakeholder engagement and the like, but not at the level and sophistication that you need to do it in a program, typically. But in order to drive those benefits, when you're talking about multiple projects working together to deliver major benefits to an organization, understanding who those stakeholders are, figuring that out becomes absolutely imperative to doing that. And so when I got there, I go around and I'm like, people are telling me they don't trust the BSM program. I go, what do you mean by that? They go, hey, your predecessors would come up here and they talk about what they've done and they're going to deliver this on this date and it's 3 months out, and then they miss it by 6 months. Okay, or they say they're going to do this for this amount of money and then they're way over budget. I go, okay. I go, well, let's see if I can go to work on that. So the first thing I did, literally within the first month I was there, one of the things we did do, and you also study this in a few chapters, is we had already a good measurement system in place. We had monthly in-depth program reviews where we reviewed every single project, the overall program. We had a dashboard. We were collecting all this good data. And we had these good presentations that were pulled together by the project managers and then by the program. So I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. Every single stakeholder, and I had identified well over a key dozen stakeholders, even on the outside. Every one of the key ones, I'm going to send you every month all of this material. Now, I did knowing full well that most of them are not going to go through that material in any depth. But I wanted to say, you're seeing the same thing I am, okay? But I want you to focus on the major risks and our mitigation strategies. And I'm going to bring to you the issues. I said also, every quarter, I want to show up on your doorstep. I want to spend 2 hours with you. We're going to walk through the details of the program. We're going to focus mainly on the issues and the risks of the program and what are we doing about them. But tried to take out the surprise and I started to try to build some trust. And, you know, and trust isn't something that you, especially if you've lost trust isn't something you get back magically in a day, but over time you can rebuild trust. And I thought it was critically important. Because up on the Hill, I mean, if we don't get the $300 to $500 million a year of funding in the BSM we need, we're dead as a program. And if we don't get OMB to back us to put that into the budget, we're dead as a program. So this isn't just about the IRS. I needed to get these external stakeholders to own and feel ownership of this program and feel like, yes, they wanted this to be successful and they felt like they understood what was going on. So let me tell you a story about what that meant a year later. So when I got on board, one of the projects, which had to do with the accounting, not of the, it was about a $10 billion organization, the IRS. We'd spend $10 billion to run the tax administration system of the United States, about 100,000 employees, $10 billion budget at the time. It wasn't the accounting for that, although we were implementing a new system to support that. But we were also implementing a system to do better on the revenue accounting of the At the time, it was about $2.5 trillion we were collecting on behalf of the government. So it was the revenue accounting side, as we called it, okay? The big dollars that we were tracking. And this thing was not in good shape when I arrived. It was way behind. Soon after I got there, we did an assessment of the program. We had already burned through about $250 million. We expected to have to spend. It was originally, I'm trying to recall all these numbers, but it was originally, I think, about a $400 million program. It was going to be $600 to $700 million at least, with high risk. So, so we're trying to look at this project and figure out if we could salvage this thing, try different things, work with the main contractor on it. And frankly, it seemed to me to be getting worse, not better. So about a year in, working with the CFO who was the business owner of this system, we made a hard decision, and we said we ought to pull the plug on this project, even though we had spent hundreds of millions of dollars already. And so now the thing that was good about, there's a goodness about all this, was that I had been messaging this to all these key stakeholders from almost day one I was there, that this project was in trouble. Here's where we're at. Here's the things we're trying to do. Every month giving them the update in paper, every quarter going up and talking to them, talking about the issues, trying everything we could. So by the time that the CFO and myself briefed the commissioner and he agreed, we were pulling the plug on this because we felt we could use those too high a risk, felt we could reallocate those funds more effectively to other projects in the program, to accelerate some other things, had a good plan to do all that. Time we got up and we're briefing all of the stakeholders, obviously the big concern was somebody was going to call for a hearing on the Hill. And if that had happened, we're on potentially the front page of the Washington Post. That never happened. And, and I mean, maybe this is patting myself on the back, and obviously we're always working together as a team, but I was pushing so hard for us to be transparent about this so that by the time we went to the Hill and said, guys, it doesn't make sense to continue this project. We've been briefing you for months on this. Why? What's going on? What we've been trying to do. Here's a plan on how we reallocate these funds going forward, why this is a better approach, and we're just going to have to put this thing on the back burner. Later we can get back to revenue accounting, just doesn't make sense to continue now. And lo and behold, everybody accepted that. And we never had a hearing, never made the paper, and I think it was the right decision for the taxpayer, even though, if you will, we ate a couple $100 million as the government. Because I think we would have wasted hundreds of millions more if we had tried to continue on. Hard decision, tough, we're worried about it, would it blow up in our face, but we were able to navigate through that, and I think only because we were transparent, we worked well with our stakeholders, we worked to rebuild that trust so that we could have those hard discussions. And you can kind of think of it as building up that, building up that reservoir of trust, because someday in your program you're going to need it, and if you have no trust built up, you're going to get hammered. And I've seen programs just disintegrate because they did not work that stakeholder engagement very effectively. So this is an area that I really need to focus on. You're going to be studying this. I think it is one of the critical elements of running an effective program. Let me pause there. Questions or comments on that? Okay. Not hearing anything? Okay. Wanted to talk about a couple of other things. That's kind of as a segue or keeps on the theme of stakeholder engagement. Here's a chart you're going to see soon. And it kind of is an idea of not all stakeholders are created equal. You've got some that are very, very actively engaged there up on the upper right hand of this chart. You've got some that are relatively in the bottom. I never like the term ignore. I don't buy that term. You always want to keep all stakeholders engaged to some degree. But how you treat them and what level that they're engaged can very much vary. And doing this kind of mapping, and you're going to walk through this, is really, really important. Because the last thing you want to do is get blindsided by some really key stakeholder you forgot to deal with. And so trying to really understand all of your stakeholders when you're in a program and dealing with them in the appropriate manner becomes a critical part of your job in program management. So I refer to that, but I want to talk a little bit more about this because this I think is really important. One of the things that I've become a huge believer in is good governance, and I've learned lessons the hard way. And how do you get those stakeholders, particularly the ones that are really interested in the program, that have a major stake in the program, the ones up here? I think the notion of, and what I've done a lot, is setting up what I call program boards is a great way to go. So here you'll see a structure, okay, that kind of lays this out. So at a project level, typically you have a project management office. It could just be, depending on the size of the project, could be relatively small, could be quite large if it's on large projects. But then you'll have those report to a program. You'll have a program management office. You got the program manager and his or her team. But then above that, program managers can't make all the decisions. In fact, a lot of the decisions that come to the program level are decisions that really have an impact on the business or in the mission of a government agency. And as a program manager, you're not God here, okay? You're effectively running a program on behalf of who you're supporting, which is the business, it's a government agency, whatever it is, and they have real say and need to have real say into what's going on. And so this idea of having a program board, I've instituted numerous times, and it's always worked in helping me. And what is this? This is a team, typically of executives that are some of the key stakeholders. So what I usually try to do is, if there's truly one business owner, if the program is there for one business owner, that individual, that executive who's that business owner, hopefully is the chairperson of that program board. That's the best way to do it. It may be someone else, but around the table, you're going to have the program manager, of course, but then you're going to have other key stakeholders. Who else is really important to this to make sure things are going well? And it's so valuable because if you meet on a regular basis, if you keep this board informed, when the hard decisions need to be made, the trade-off decisions that come up, okay? And it may not be anything the program did. The program may be swimmingly well, doing great, and now a new requirement comes in, a new major requirement, a change in business strategy, new regulation that impacts things in a big way. All of a sudden you have to shift, right? And all of a sudden the benefits that you were going to provide, maybe they shift. Well, that always is going to cause issues, and you want to make the best business decisions you can. And having an informed program board is a great way to help ensure program success, and frankly also deal with the hard spots. Okay, when there are issues on the program, having an informed board so they've been brought along, they understand what the issues are, why they've happened, gets away from the finger pointing, gets them engaged. If you do it right, you got a real team. So I think it's a really key part of engaging your stakeholders, the key stakeholders, and setting up a governance model that can work very, very effectively for you. And just to put a key aspect of that, touching on that, this is a very complex chart, and I'm not trying to debrief the chart in any real detail to you, but I I show it to you because this is what we evolved to in the IRS. Remember I mentioned more than 350 systems that support tax administration. Well, no one person, the complexity of that alone, even our chief architect, for he to get his arms around all that, impossible. This human, I mean, it's just way beyond human complexity that you can, any one person can understand. So breaking things down. So you'll see here in the middle, these boxes that look teal, let's call it. These were, if you will, the various portfolios that we had defined, okay, as part of the enterprise architecture. So things like criminal investigation, which is its own unit. The chief counsel office, again, on unit. But then you see things like customer service, filing and payment compliance, managing taxpayer accounts, submission processing. But then we had infrastructure, okay, the underlying IT infrastructure. So these were all portfolios, and we had, if you will, steering committees for these portfolios that were made up of the right, again, engaged stakeholders. So you'd have some business executives, you'd have some IT executives, and and then under that, if they were small portfolios per se, then the programs under that portfolio would report to that portfolio. Okay, so you might have a program that was governed by a portfolio body, but you might have that broken down where we actually had, there was so much complexity that we'd actually have a governance body around a particular area. So I want to talk about one. So in submission processing, I mentioned Modernized e-file. And Modernized e-file was a very important project within the BSM portfolio and very important to the business, particularly to the business that was called large and mid-sized business, which was one of the business units of the IRS. And they were the business unit that worked with the large corporations and the mid-sized corporations. And so if you remember, I said that we were first rolled Modernized e-file out to the corporate for corporate returns. And so we were building this system, and the then Commissioner Mark Everson of the IRS came to myself and to Debbie Nolan at the time. Debbie was the leader of this large and mid-sized business unit that I mentioned, and he said, I want to mandate filing for the largest corporations in America, the e-file, next year. And after we picked our jaws off the floor because we hadn't even gone to beta yet on this system. Now the plan was to have it in production by then, but there could be no missteps if we were going to make this, timing-wise. And so we said, well, give us a couple of weeks to come back to you and before we promise you we could do this, because he wanted to publicly announce this. So we went off and we did some studying, made sure, looked at our, looked at all of the where we were on the execution of the project. It was going well, which was the good news. Looked at our management reserve from schedule-wise and what we could do there. And one of the things we looked at was we had set up a governance board, okay, around e-filing. And it was chaired by Dubby and myself. So we already had that implementation of a governance board. And what we decided to do was we said for the next, I think it was 15 months, we're going to meet weekly as a governance board, weekly. And if we're going to do this, because there was very little slack in our schedule to be able to make this. And so we went back to the commissioner and we said, hey, there's some risk, but here's what we're doing to mitigate the risk. And we talked about all the steps we're taking, including these weekly governance board meetings we were going to do. And he took the risk. And he went out publicly and announced that he was mandating that all the largest corporations in America had the e-file the next year. And there was kind of howling in the streets for two reasons. One was, oh my God, you got all this work we're going to have to do on our side. And then there was, the howling was also laughter about, there is no way the IRS is going to deliver this. No way. And so we went to work. We did meet weekly. I mean, it was not always easy because it was like every single meeting was What are the impediments? What are the risks? What are the impediments that could cause a schedule slippage? What are we doing to fix them? And I'll tell you, if you can get two, I mean, we're talking about in the IRS, probably 2 of the top 10 senior executives of the whole IRS running this thing. Every single week we're doing that. If you really want to deliver something that's that important to an organization, and if you put that kind of management attention and focus on it with the right governance model, you can do amazing things. And we delivered it. It was successful, highly successful. We proved everybody wrong, and it built a lot of credibility for the IRS, a lot of credibility. And so, but it also hopefully paints a picture for you. If you're a program manager and it's a really important thing, putting that program governance board in place and meeting on the right, I'm not trying to say you meet every week, but I would say in anything fast moving, and you're going to be using agile techniques today in almost anything you do, meeting more, I mean, if you're stretching it out and meeting quarterly, I would say that's not enough. Not enough at all. Meeting monthly might be the right rhythm for a lot of programs. But that kind of engagement, that kind of buy-in is what you need for important programs that can really change an organization. Yes, please. Allison, is it?
Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering, what do you do in the scenario where you're being asked to play God and make everything happen as soon as possible, but you do not have the stakeholders and the executive sponsors willing to give the time that's required to move fast? How do you communicate to those people how critical it is for them to be involved at that level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had an answer that worked in all situations. I think it's if you truly have, it's a very important program, and they're not engaged. The first thing you ask is how important is it to them, really? But the other point is you got to educate, and you got to bring people along by them starting to understand the importance of their participation, or maybe it's a trusted agent of theirs. Okay, maybe it's the deputy, or it's someone that they trust, but that their input is so important that it's almost like we can't be successful if I'm making these decisions without your input. Maybe it's not you personally, but I need your business input to make the right decisions for this program, and to educate. And I know it sounds trivial what I just said to do. It's not. I get it. It's hard discussions, and you don't want to come across like, well, I don't want to run the program. That's not the point. You got to educate people as the importance of having the right stakeholder engagement to effectively run the program, because you can't and you shouldn't be making decisions without the right kind of business input. It's just a tenet of good program management. And so I wish I had a better answer that could work in all situations, but I think it's education, building that trust, them understanding, them getting it, that the importance of getting their involvement. I don't know if I helped you, but that.
Yeah, no, it was helpful. Thank you.
That's I can do right now that off the top of my head. I think about it more, but that's the best I can do off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. For time, let me move on. But that, and by the way, on this IRS governance model, obviously very complex, large organization, 100,000 employees. Most organizations wouldn't have nearly as much complexity. But think about this. I mean, and we also had, as you can see here, thresholds regarding issues and risks, and when things needed to bump up to the next level. So that if you could build something like this, we got this really working well in the IRS when I was there, and it was very, very meaningful. And it felt like at the top of it, up at these governance bodies at the most senior levels, we felt like we were dealing with the right issues. We were dealing with the right things were coming up to our level. And that's what you want to see happening. The decision making being made at the right level in a multi-tiered model where you are dealing with multiple portfolios and multiple programs under the portfolios. Okay. Just a couple other points that I'd like to make here, and I think I want to reflect a little bit on my time at DHS. So I was, as I mentioned, I actually became the CIO of IRS, and ultimately, for a while, was the Deputy Commissioner for Operations. So I actually rose to the number 2 in the IRS while I was there. So I did have a meaningful impact, I think, and you know, one of the things, and I think one of the things I'm proudest of in my career was that not during my tenure, but the IRS was on something called the GAO high risk list for decades because of their inability to modernize themselves. They came off of that high risk list, which is really hard to get off of, by the way. They came off of that high risk list for their IT modernization efforts about 5 years ago or so. Now, I had been gone a number of years, but I'd like to think, and it's always a team effort, but I'd like to think that I was one of the catalysts of things that we put in place that helped make a real difference. And I think the disciplines we put in place around governance, around center of excellence, that could help projects or programs that were in trouble in these areas, you know, was kind of a force multiplier kind of model where we, in particular with new projects or programs kicking off, to use those, okay, to help get it started right. Because that's another thing that I've learned. You want to really lose trust quickly is start your program and go into the ditch right away. You'll lose a lot of credibility and trust right out of the gate. So doing the upfront planning, the things you looked at earlier in this course around a good program plan, a good business model, you know, these are imperative to starting right and getting it off on the right foot. And we use these centers of excellence and the expertise that we build in these centers of excellence to help projects and programs get started right, and then help them if they ran into trouble. And I think that model also really, really helped the IRS. And one other point, and not that I had anything directly to do with it, but if you recall when when Obamacare was passed, that was a heavy lift for a couple of agencies. One of them was HHS and healthcare.gov. And if you recall, that was a real fiasco when they first rolled out healthcare.gov, where you signed up. If you didn't have your health insurance through a company or an agency, you signed up through healthcare.gov, and it was a real disaster. And in fact, I actually testified on the Hill about that and why that. And if you read my testimony, it's all about why they didn't do good program management. But setting that aside, the other big lift was at the IRS, because the IRS had to implement new tax forms. They had to implement a whole new system in order to handle the fact that there was now tax implications around all this. And that went off. I mean, you never read about that. And that was a good thing because it went very. And so to me, that was a good example of the IRS using its maturity in program management in order to effectively deliver a large scale. In fact, that was hundreds of millions of dollars as well in order to implement that. Dawn, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, a lot of governance model is embedded in my head, at least, the idea that you had the right people that you were able to engage at the IRS to become part of your program office. And I'm just wondering how much of the people that you met were engaged in that process versus how many you had to bring in order to help implement the right set of people, either at the top or anywhere in the middle.
Well, I'll tell you, when I got there, as I mentioned before, we had it was a small office at the time when I arrived.
Right.
And so beefing up the program management office itself was something I really wanted to work on, and we added quite a few people to that. But I think more to your question, the stakeholder engagement was not good. Remember I mentioned I went around and there was not a lot of trust, including within the IRS on the business side. Certainly the legacy had no trust, as I mentioned before. So working to change that model and change that whole dynamic was a big part of my job, especially the first year, was to really reorient the way in which we were working those things.
Because
And, you know, and
part of the problem
it's not easy.
I'm having is, was this sort of for you when you went to go meet stakeholders, you went to find people who are also able to participate in the process, right? Not everybody is. A lot of stakeholders are not capable, actually, of sort of being a part of the process.
Not capable. I might take a little exception to that. If for instance, if you're a stakeholder and you're in the business and I want you, and you're an executive and I want you on part of a program, I mean, I just forced the model of we're going to set up these program governance boards. I mean, I'd say you're talking about programs that are projects. Some of these projects were hundreds of millions of dollars each themselves. To say, if it's that scale and that important, we need to govern these right. Mm-hmm. And we would educate people about their role. I mean, a big part of this was educating people about the role that they needed to play on these boards. But a lot of it was bringing their perspective as business people. What importance? And then when you got them educated on the program and the project, let's say, then you know when an issue came up, then they would be in a good position to be able to weigh in. You know, okay, I can defer this part of it if we can move over here and get this done. I mean, those are the kinds of discussions you'd be having all the time. And keep an eye on the ball about the ultimate benefits realization. So now you're right in that I also try to make sure we're engaging at a deeper level with the business, getting the right analyst on the project so that we could bring their learning. You know, sometimes we had to go deeper and really twist arms, if you will, sometimes going up to the commissioner and saying, I need more expertise from the business on this because we're not going to be successful otherwise. Mm-hmm. But those are the kinds of discussions you need to have. I was lucky. I built a really strong relationship with the then commissioner of the IRS, which really helped. And obviously that top level cover becomes important on very large complex programs. But that notion that you do need the right people, no doubt. But you also need to educate, particularly of executives, on the role they need to play in this.
Gotcha.
And they'll get it if you can get them the right data. If they can, you know, and you can really get them to the table and have the right kinds of discussions. You know, in the end, they appreciate it because they feel like a lot of them don't want to be engaged because they're scared of it. They don't understand it. They don't feel like you're right. But if you can educate them in the right way and get them engaged, you know, challenge them on the things they need to be challenged on about, hey, business priorities. Don't talk about the technology. Let's talk about your business priorities. Okay, we have a major trade-off decision we need to make on where we're going with this project as part of this program. We can go A, B, or C, and here are the business implications of those. Talk to us about your business priorities, and then have a real business discussion, not a technology discussion. A lot of times that will help.
Great.
Right? Okay. I'm just about out of time. Although I do want to, are there any other questions before I wrap up? Anybody have? Okay. You know, I think I do want to leave you with a couple other points, and then I'll wrap up. I didn't brief this chart, but I just throw it in here. You're going to talk about this as well. Measurement of a program and the projects under the program, how well they're doing, very important. But also, you got to be realistic. And I've seen programs and projects go off the deep end of trying to measure so many things. Measure, you know, as a program manager, really think about what it is, the data that you really need, and how often you need it in order to effectively understand where you're at and to give you trending so you can project where you're going. That's critical. But also recognize that you can get caught up, and I've seen program management offices get caught up in so much detail, trying to capture so much data that I think they lose perspective, and they're spending too much time and effort on that versus actually managing the program itself. And so that striking that right balance is kind of critical, and you kind of know it over time as you get more and more facile and more experience doing these things. But really try to focus on what are the things I really need to know to be able to effectively manage this program. And then I just want to leave you and maybe circle back on a couple of points that have served me well as a program manager, which is we present all this material to you and all kind of in the nature of tools to help you, things that you hopefully are best practices that you can live by. But keep in mind that you can't control everything. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of things outside the program that affect the program. And some of those things may not be working very well at all. But that doesn't leave you off the hook as a program manager. And in fact, in those areas, you got to view those as real risks. And you got to kind of double down your mitigation efforts to try to mitigate those risks. So great example, if you don't have a good any semblance of what we would traditionally call an enterprise architecture, kind of standards, rules of the road on how things are done, then you're going to have to create your own infrastructure, for instance. You may probably use cloud infrastructure these days in an IT program, although, by the way, the things I'm talking about transcend technology. They're not just about IT. But in an IT example, you might have to set up your whole own IT infrastructure if you don't have a good enterprise architecture with a set of standards for infrastructure already and capabilities. But the point is you got to understand where you sit in that regard from what's on the outside of you, not just what's on the inside, what you own control. And if there are things you don't control but are not, quote, best practice, you got to view those as risks and treat them as such. But you can't ignore them because they could ruin your program. And the last thing I'd leave you with is so much of it is about real leadership, and surprisingly so. When I came into the DHS, I said I want to review every single large major IT program. Lo and behold, I didn't know there were 92 of them, but I reviewed 92 programs. Couple hours, some of them 6 hours. On each one. So that's a heavy lift. And I forced the program managers to come in. I gave them a template. I said, here's the presentation I want. And it was stunning to me. Within 15 or 20 minutes, I could tell you whether that program was running well or was a disaster. It didn't take very long. It didn't take very long. And, you know, so much of it comes on, not that it's just you, the individual program manager, but you and your team doing these things right, okay? Doesn't mean you won't run into issues, doesn't mean you're not going to have to really course correct things, but you know, if you start out with the right team, with the right experience, okay, you will immediately start to do those things right. You will course correct as you need to, and you'll be open and honest with those stakeholders about where things really stand. And if you do that and you start to build that trust, you know, really work to have some early successes so you build some credibility, which builds even more trust, and then you're well on your way to delivering a program that can add a lot of business benefit. So I will stop there. You're in great hands with Larry. I hope you've enjoyed the course to date. I will give you my email address. It's Richard_Spires, S-P-I-R-E-S, at learningtree.com. If you have other questions for me, you want to shoot me a note, try to answer some additional questions for you. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Larry.